Welcome, everyone, to Broad Strokes of ROUGE, a show where we aim to paint the future of the animation industry in Southeast Asia. The idea behind the show is that we were looking for a space to learn about where the animation industry is at and where it's going, but we couldn't find one, so we decided to make one. And in doing so, we're going to draw in experts in their respective fields to answer questions about topics like the role of art in making the world a better place, how films get funded in Southeast Asia, AI, and plenty more. My name is Ben Peace. I'll be hosting this podcast, and I'm representing the broader team behind the ROUGE Collective, an animation studio in Southeast Asia founded on the idea that visual storytelling can be a force of good, tackling social issues through our favorite medium. Find out more at withrouge.com. So with that said, on to our first episode, where we're going to be tackling the not at all controversial topic of artificial intelligence. Nobody listening will need to be told that AI is suddenly everywhere. Or at least it certainly feels like it is, with hype around AI impacting all industries, but especially creative industries, feeding both excitement and fear. Big studio execs like Jeffrey Katzenberg at DreamWorks have talked about the fact that AI could cut the cost of animation by up to 90%, which is potentially great news if you're a budding director or producer, but maybe catastrophic news if you're an animator who fears for their job being replaced, or you're an artist whose work is being used without permission or compensation. So today, with our guests, who I will be introducing in just a moment, we're going to be discussing some of the realities of what's happening today, some predictions of what we should expect in the near future. Is the coming AI wave inevitable? Should we simply make the best of it? Is a hard reset what we want? If that's possible at all even. So a bit of a disclaimer up front, this podcast more generally is going to be discussing the state of animation in Southeast Asia. But as AI is such a global phenomenon, we've got, for this episode, folk from outside of the region. So with all of that said, let me introduce our two AI experts. So our first guest is Igor Lodeiro. Igor's had a long career in the animation world as a visual effects and CG specialist. He's worked on huge DreamWorks productions, Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3, How to Train Your Dragon, Puss in Boots, Madagascar 3, and Trolls. Igor, I actually helped work on Trolls as well, so we could maybe talk about that later. Awards he's picked up have included Annie and Emmy Awards for films like Three Below and Tales of Arcadia Wizards. And then more recently, Igor spent time in China working as a visual effects supervisor at Base Media, developing new approaches to content creation using USD, Blender, Unreal, and other AI tools. Igor's now based over in San Sebastian. So Igor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this.
Super. Our next guest is Ben Zhao, professor of computer science at the University of Chicago. So Ben's focused a lot of his time on security and privacy in machine learning. He's been vocal about the consequences of replacing human creatives with generative AI. And notably, in an article for the United Nations Commission on Science and Technology for Development, sorry, easy for you to say, of his recent projects, two are really pertinent for today's discussion, Glaze and Nightshade. Without revealing too much about these projects, these are tools that act as defense against Gen AI models training on artist work without consent. So more of that for sure later. Ben, thank you so much for joining all the way from Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So let's kick off. Igor, it would be great maybe for people listening if we could kind of zoom out and just talk initially about how artificial intelligence is being used practically day to day in the animation industry.
That is a very, very broad question to start with. It depends who is using the AI tools. It depends what they are using it for. It depends the kind of studio and in which country they are using it. So there's multiple answers for that question. So I can tell you the way that I know the tool is being used. And I have to say, there's a lot of hype about the way these tools work and what they can do. And when you really look under the hood of what they are really doing, it's not as much as it looks like. So I will say, in general, these tools, they allow you to move faster through content creation, through speccing, prototyping, and even like to cut time when you're like producing some content, some background work, some projections. Like they are not a tool that you just use and replace animation pipeline. They are tools that allow the artist to move through the work faster.
And so those examples, maybe it would be good just to give some specific examples of that. So they're kind of basically tools for augmenting what content creators, animators are already doing.
So it could be many ways. For example, you're an studio, you have your own IP that you have developed for a long time. You train an AI like a LoRa with your style of work, with your content work that you have provided. You have a bunch of materials that you can feed this LoRa to start producing things on your style. So additional new content that you create, you can base it on all this training that you have done for the AI, and it will assist you on developing new concept art very quickly, on speaking out ideas. It's a potential use for in pre-production. There's multiple applications of this, and this will be a very straightforward use of AI in a legitimate way.
And is that so? You know, if I, and speaking as a bit of a layperson, I've done some work in sort of content industries, but kind of peripherally. If you look sort of from the start of a production to the very end, you know, there's the kind of ideation, thinking initially about very broad concepts, and then you know, storyboarding and scripting. And are people actually using it for all of those different things? Or you said earlier, there's a lot more hype than reality. So like, how much of it really day to day is being genuinely used?
Well, I follow a lot of people that they are testing and experimenting of uses. Like there's people that they're attempting at 3D model creation, or at least like, you know, some kind of maquette or basic 3D pre-visualization based on a piece of concept art. There's some people that are using it for motion capture, retargeting metahumans in Unreal with AI motion capture. There's different applications. There's people that use ChatGPT to like flash an idea for a sequence, for a shot. Like they you know, there's many uses in across the whole pipeline of production. Even like you can use it for interpolating frames because it's very good. Like there's some tools that will allow you to recalculate. And now it's been implemented by major software developers like Adobe or like Foundry, and they have a support for a lot of AI tools that they assist on the workflow inside of those tools.
And this maybe is a bit of an unfair kind of question because it's so general, but just again, for the purposes of scale, in your experience, what's the level of maybe time saving that you're getting from these tools?
So I think at the moment, through untested pre-production is probably the place where you can save more time, because basically the biggest issues with image generation is stability and control. And because those two things are hard to achieve and require a lot of time and investment, you know, they are not used so broadly. Like it's possible, but it requires a lot of time and experience. But single image generation, it's quite easy to do with Stable Diffusion, for example. So anything in pre-production, from concept design, like environment design, key lighting, keyframe preparation, or like even like trying to envision possible framings for a shot, or all that areas, is a major saver of time, like 50-60%.
Wow.
Thanks.
So that feels like, certainly in some cases, the hype is justified. So Ben, switching over to you, it sounds like there's some real positive stuff happening. You know, that from everything Igor's just said, that all sounds like, you know, it's enhancing individuals. It's not necessarily replacing people. It's allowing people to do things quicker, maybe help them, you know, with idea creation. That all sounds pretty positive. But having read upon a little bit of your work, I feel like you might be able to talk to a slightly different view. So maybe if you know, in the vein of giving the good, the bad, and the ugly, do you want to just kind of give us your view to maybe some of those examples, and maybe the other side of the debate, maybe?
Sure. I mean, you know, two sides to every coin, right? But I think, I'm not someone who sort of tries to push my opinion on others. So I'm just going to talk about sort of my take on things. And obviously, I think, folks interpret things very differently, based on everyone's own experiences and whatnot. So I think, there's a few issues here. One is that there is absolutely job replacement. So when we talk about doing things faster, well, one of the reasons that, potentially things are faster, again, I'm speaking from a total outsider who is not anywhere near the entertainment industry. I just interact with a bunch of people who are, at different levels of the entertainment industry. And if I may say, Igor, love your movies, really enjoyed some of those are some of my kids and my favorites, so it's wonderful to see you. So, I think there's a few things. One is just where the tools come from. And so it is clear, I don't think anyone disputes the fact that these tools, particularly Stable Diffusion, which is most widely used because it is open source, because anyone can train a LoRa on it, is coming from, it's being trained on millions and millions of artists or product without consent and without compensation. So, that side of the ethics of where this tool comes from is a real issue. And again, people may not have a personal issue with that. But I think it is oftentimes the case that I've talked to, whether it's companies or individuals, that it's never quite as clear an issue until you are actually involved on the other end, right? And of course, depending on your job and creation position in the pipeline, sometimes folks may not feel the direct effects of these models. But even as companies go, I think broadly speaking, I talked to game developers, I talked to some movie studios and animation studios, and one of the issues that comes around is there's almost always a single cycle, which is that in the very beginning, everyone is very excited about the increase in productivity, which again, sort of, I'm not getting enough into it, but there is job replacement because the speed up that you're getting, the sort of that acceleration and reduction in cost, really, where's that cost going to? Well, it's probably otherwise would have gone to artists who you hired. But now, eliminating conceptual artists, illustrators who are doing the initial ideation stage, for example. But there's always a cycle where companies first get excited about the reduction in prices and costs and the speed of productivity and so on, which is great, from a sort of a distance perspective. And then it takes maybe a few months for people to realize that, oh, well, apparently this doesn't just stop with, sort of specific artists, these harms. And then they realize that everyone is in fact vulnerable to this. And then they, in fact, at some point do get trained into models. And that's when, they're frantically not so much worrying about expenses anymore, but very quickly, looking for the right lawyers to hire and to build up that law team. And it sounds like a joke, but it actually happens, and it happens consistently. And so I think it's important to understand that while, it may be distant from any one of us at any given point, the reality is that this sort of modus operandi of taking data and then training it into the model for whatever purposes, because there is no restriction, there's no limit to what you can do, that impacts everyone up and down the chain, right? And so whether you produce entire well-built games with cutscenes that now can be sucked out into training models so that someone else can take your characters and your IP and have them do whatever it is that they want without your permission or authorization or consent, or movies where your characters can now be taken and, let's say, built into completely other movies, animated shorts or others, without your consent. And I think once people start seriously thinking about that and actually seeing some of those effects, seeing some of that product, then the perspectives tend to change. Nothing like convincing argument, nothing as convincing as seeing some of these things actually directly impact you and your work. So I think there's a lot of different nuances about this, but the reality is that there is job loss. There's significant job loss. There's a lot of research reports out there. Now, whether that is right or wrong, and some people say that's just the cost of technology and innovation and whatnot, that may be. So I'm not going to argue about economics and those kind of things. I think the reality of it is that we are not ready as a society for the amount of unemployment that's about to come. But aside from that, there's the ethical angle of how good do you feel about using a tool that is built on the training of some of your coworkers and colleagues without their consent, and that a tool that directly puts them out of business. And then there's the final point, which I'll stop, which is that longer term, I think there's a more detrimental impact on the longer arc of time and human society and human creativity, which is perhaps longer reaching but more compelling, which is that regardless of how it impacts any single one of us or any single production or product, it is true and sort of undeniable that these tools and their use are decimating the future of these industries, because these aspiring artists and students are in art schools are dropping out like flies, because they are seeing their mentors and heroes and well-known high-profile artists who've been doing that since 20, 30 years basically drop out and go drive Ubers or completely abandon the craft. Right. And if we're okay with the fact that maybe art becomes no longer a viable profession and it's only going to be a hobby, then perhaps that's okay. But I think that would be a travesty. And if we ever get there, if we get to the point where these pipelines of future artists and animators and all these creatives die out because they see no future in that line of work, so does AI. AI, no matter how well you can argue it, it's still completely dependent on the data, on the training data. And it does not learn by itself. There is no sentience. And training on its own output sooner or later will cause the model to collapse. There's research confirming nearly all of these aspects. And so, longer term, if you want to save AI, it is necessary to save the human creatives and the industry that eventually still needs to feed that AI machine to help train it.
Wow. Well, I mean, there was a lot in there, Ben. So let me, for my own little brain, let me separate that everything that you said into sort of three areas. So you talked first about the sort of the basic economic piece, which I think technology has come in waves of innovation over the last 300 years, and that's kind of happened a lot. So I think of all of them, we can all have a view on that. That maybe is the least controversial one. We can maybe park that one. The second one relates to there's rather than just kind of competing with AI and you get out of the job because they're doing it. It's I did some work and now there's some cheating going on, and a bit of a shortcut, and that there's sort of fairness around that. And then the final bit, which I'd love to kind of get into a bit deeper, is what this means in terms of the creative industries and even AI beyond that, which is sort of is pretty kind of meta. So let's go to those later. But I'd love to kind of just pause on point two, because this is obviously where you've done some really interesting work, which, as far as I understand, is sort of kind of going live as we speak. So this is really interesting for people listening to know about, because this, from what I understand, is pretty groundbreaking in terms of the way that for that second point, where individuals, companies, whoever has done work to create something, whether it's a piece of art or it's game or what have you, that can be put into a model, used as training data, and then they're not getting compensated. And the work that you've done is to disrupt that process, and to support those people that have originally produced the work. So maybe you can tell us a bit about those projects, because I think that it sounds like they're going to make a bit of a splash in this field.
I don't know about splash, but we'll see. I mean, so there's two projects. Glaze started, it's been more than a year now. Started in March. We released the first prototype of Glaze in March 2023. And Glaze is really meant as a sort of an immediate short-term mitigation shield for artists who are personally being attacked by Loras. And this was happening significantly, quite a bit already, even early last year, where there are entire marketplaces for this now, where if you really like someone's art, you just take their art, you take 10, 15, 20 pieces of it, you fine tune a model on it. And now, voila, you've got a model, in the style of Greg Grutowski or Carlo Ortiz or any one of these artists. And now you can have it pump out, at speed, at incredibly speed. whatever art you want without their permission, without their knowledge, without their consent. There are entire marketplaces for this. Of course, it is direct replacement of specific artists. And basically, when an artist sees that happened to them, effectively speaking, it's career over. When you've built up a reputation or have, a huge following based on your style, and then a model basically takes it and says, this is not quite great, but it's gonna mostly look like rag if you just want something really fast and cheap. That'll do it. So the direct harm is real immediate, and a lot of artists see this, and it's not just the economic costs and the personal nature of it. It's literally like, you've worked 20, 30 years to hone your craft, and someone has literally pulled it off of you like a skin and is wearing you like a puppet in ways that you cannot control or even imagine. To the point where now, if you go online, in fact, this is fairly widespread. If you Google for specific artist names, many times the images that come out of those Google results are not from the artist. They are mimicries generated by models pretending to be the artist. And so imagine if that is the case for you, right? Whatever world you work in, whatever your work product is, if one day you made it and have a reputation, and the next day you wake up and when someone Googles your name, you don't get your work product, you get someone's mockery of your work product, and on topics that you would perhaps find incredibly objectionable, but it doesn't matter because you don't get a say anymore. So Glaze was designed to disrupt that. And basically what it does is it goes over your art image, and it does a mathematical computation targeting a specific AI model that does, in fact, transfer to other models. But you start with one model, and it changes it in such a way, it's incredibly subtle. It changes almost all the pixels on the image, but it does so in a way that the image looks basically identical to human eyes. But the image looks very different to AI eyes. And so when someone tries to train a model based on your images, if you do charcoal portraits that are very dark and brooding, it'll come back like, bright, cheery, Vincent van Gogh type of impressionism, for example. And if we can do that, then basically that's the goal, and that's what Glaze sort of does. So artists can protect themselves at an individual level. And then later on, very quickly, we provided Nightshade. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just pausing there. We'll jump into Nightshade in a second. But Igor, what's your view on that then? So you talked about you use for ideation some of these tools. This product's going to maybe screw some of that up. So what's your sort of response? What's your feeling about this entering the world?
I think this is a really good tool, frankly. When you use these tools professionally, you definitely don't base your work on existing artists. I mean, all these companies, they have a liability, and if the outcome of the art is very similar to any given artist, it's really obvious, right? Like, none of the companies that I work for, at least in the West, will dare to have this approach. And in fact, they are very, very careful of like what kind of models you use. Are those models cleanly trained? Are those models just synthetic training or like completely based? Like, people professionally, reputable companies are very mindful of the kind of data the models are trained off. Now, I think what Ben is referring to is there's a huge population of frustrated artists out there, like users, that for many years they weren't able to draw anything, to do much, and now they have these mid-journeys and these tools, and they love these artists, and they finally find themselves painting in the style of these artists. And I think that's the 98% of what you see online using this kind of approach. But I think professionally, this will not happen because this will be so obvious. Nobody will like this. Did you hire this artist for concept art? No. Well, how come your art is literally that style? It will be impossible to defend, like any game, like any production, like it's simply impossible to defend. So for professionally, this is great. I'm very glad to protect artists. I work with amazing concept artists and all kinds of artists all my career, and I agree. This is a direct threat for them, and I'm so glad that tools like this will come to existence so they can protect themselves. I think this is a great initiative.
That's brilliant to hear. So I mean, it sounds like super positive. Basically, from a professional perspective, you'd always want to be using clean training data anyway, and so it's a small number of bad actors potentially. And the work, Ben, that you were talking about is maybe going to sort of protect against at least those. Okay, great. So then what was step 2, Ben? So Nightshade.
Right. So I mean, things get murky, right? When you sort of talk about topics like this, and one of the challenges, is that well, I'm not going to talk about copyright or the output of AI tools and the challenges of getting copyright there. I mean, I think all that's still evolving. So Nightshade really is addressing this larger issue, which is, today, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a game developer, if you're a movie studio, if you're an individual artist, it doesn't matter. If you have content that's online, it will be trained in a model sooner or later, right? And we're seeing that happen to game studios now. If you look at like Riot Games, obviously very well known in the industry, incredibly popular set of games, they already have stable diffusion models that someone has taken still frames out of cutscenes from various games and trained on them. And now they can basically, take these models and then have Riot characters do whatever it is that the user wants them to do, right? Perhaps, produce cutscenes or short animated shorts of their own. So it's that level of sort of lack of control that we're trying to deal with, which is, it doesn't matter if you're big or small, independent or corporate, your content can be trained without your consent anytime. And so what Nightshade does is basically it acts like a poison pill. You add it to images, and in a case, actually recently we actually built a framework to extend that to videos. You can actually do this to frames in a video and get some speed up. But what happens is that when you apply Nightshade, it doesn't so much protect the individual style, it actually changes the composition of what's in the image. And so, for example, if you have a short movie about, a puppy running around the yard, you can take those frames and run it through Nightshade, and then any AI model that tries to train on it will in fact see a small cat, for example, running around the yard. And what that does to the model then is it learns the wrong association of what does a cat look like? What does a dog look like? And when you then go to that model again and say, I want a cat, in a spacesuit on the moon, you'll get a dog in a spacesuit on the moon. And in fact, if you get enough of these sort of poison effects, the models themselves actually start to collapse and start returning gibberish for anything that you give it. And so this is, if you will, basically a more technological version of copyright enforcement, because nothing really exists in that space right now. If you're an artist or an IP owner, there's nothing you can do to prevent OpenAI from downloading your content, provided it is online and it's not behind some password, paywall. If it's online accessible, it will be trained. And that's sort of the wild, wild west we have out there. And Nightshade is basically deterrent. It just says that if you keep doing this and you do it at scale, your models will get corrupted sooner or later. And these tools like Nightshade are very hard to detect. And so if you're a model trainer, the danger of doing this, if you continue to train on content without consent, is that it will cost you plenty of training and other costs in your model corruption.
I mean, that sounds like an absolutely incredible tool. And notwithstanding, I'd hate for anyone listening to think that there's going to be a generation of kids that think cats are dogs because of their searches coming back wrong. I guess, the idea is that this is only going to be used for essentially protecting copyrighted material. So it's not about poisoning kind of general information that's out there or the general model training, which is all for good, and education and plenty of other really positive outcomes for use of AI. This is very much to apply this software to whether it's animation or still imagery, so that artists are able to, without fear of it getting copied or misused, they can put it out in the public domain, they can advertise it, they can say, come to my show, they can say, look at my great work, without worry for that getting stolen. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about like how promotion and how content is distributed online, it's impossible not to share bits and pieces of it, right? So even movies, larger in theater movies, you had to release posters. you have to release trailers, and of course that is what builds up the hype for the film and the audience for it. And so, yeah, all those things. You don't need a whole lot to train LoRa, as you guys well know. So, so yeah, you have to protect all those assets. Otherwise, who's going to make these movies when these movie characters? Imagine if the next Marvel movie comes out, 6 months before the Marvel movie comes out, all of a sudden you've got a parody of it already, or worse yet, someone leaks the plot and just builds the movie from scratch, and it's a horrid, sort of mimicry version of it with, occasionally extra fingers and details that normal artists would not want in a movie. That would be disastrous. So it's to protect sort of general intellectual property at a very high level. Yeah.
Well,
I have a question related to these two tools, if I may.
Please.
So I have a question just because this technology sounds really good to me. So for example, if someone finds some materials online, like let's say an image or a trailer, if they acquire that data, like even like a snapshot of window or like just a screen recording, if they do some noise processing or color corrections, the protection remains, is still valid?
Yes.
No,
yes.
That's pretty cool.
In fact, you can do lots of adversarial things to it. There are built-in protections to make the protections robust. And there's a lot of sort of security and cryptographic protection layers inside. So even targeted attacks that try to revert or even detect these effects are very challenging.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, because I mean, typically the way people acquire all this data is very nasty. Yeah, they don't just grab a source file or anything. They just screen record, put it on Premiere, reformat, change the scaling, like so depending how the algorithm works, I was wondering if it it will be able to handle this.
Yeah. No, screenshots is the first thing that we test against. Of course, that has to preserve. I mean, really, it works not so much on a sort of computerized storage bits and zeros and ones level. It works really at the level of image representation. And so as long as the image itself is largely preserved, the subtle shifts in tone, color, pixel values is what carries the actual protection through. So yeah, all these things, compression, resampling, different format, exchange, even cropping and lighting shifts, exposure, those kind of things. Generally speaking, and the only time that this protection really starts to fall apart is when you distort the original image so much that actually trying to train on it at some point will become difficult because the original information is being lost.
Yeah, that seems really good tech for protection then.
And Ben, is this how is it working? So if people listening want to use this, is it open source? Is it free? Is it a subscription? Are you making money out of this? What's the plan? How do people use it?
Right. I made a promise to artists when we first started this project back in October or November of 2022 that we will never commercialize it. There's no IP. There's no startup. There's no patents. There's no hidden fees of any kind. Glaze is not open source. It is freeware. You can download it. Anyone can download it. It's ready there for all the major platforms. We even have a web version if you don't have a computer or you don't have a GPU, and you can just sign up for an account. We pay for it out of our own GPU storage in the lab. You upload an image, it processes on the spot, sends it to you, and deletes everything immediately. So yeah, that's the whole sort of goal of all this. We're not going to commercialize it, and we don't work with any commercial entities in any way so that other people can profit from it. The entire point is to help protect artists who need a protection.
Amazing. Well, it certainly sounds like a noble enterprise, and one that I'm sure a lot of people will want to find out more about. You've got at least one customer in Igor, it sounds like. Okay, so maybe if we sort of pivot a little bit, Igor, one thing I want to pick up on what you said earlier. You were talking about sort of professional usage, and you said not in the West, at least. So without getting into sort of major geopolitics, but is that, can you give us a bit of a sense of the sort of maybe East versus West? It doesn't even necessarily have to be specific to this particular point, but is there a big difference? You worked in China for a while. You obviously worked in the US. You're currently in Spain. Do you see big differences in the way that AI is being used, applied? across the two different regions?
I will say so. Yes, I think in general in the West there's a lot of awareness of artists' rights being violated and mindfulness about how to use trained data that is using copyrighted materials. There's definitely an awareness, even if people decide to use it or not, but there's an awareness. I feel sometimes in the East, something is cool, something works, something's fast. They tend to embrace technology very quickly, no matter what, no many questions asked. And I think in some cases, it might be, they might not even realize like the negative aspects of it. They just love tech. They love things that do things that they want to do, that they can do it fast, they can do it quick. And I think, I don't know if it's a cultural aspect or what, but like it definitely happens. There's definitely this love for using new tools, using new toys, moving faster, creating new things. And I think, there's definitely a separation there from West to the East. It happens not only with AI, it happens with the way software is used, with the way the copyrighted materials are used in productions. Like it's just it's very broad spread in production.
It's interesting. I used to work in DVD back in the good old days, and the sort of the illegitimate product was always way worse. The problem was always way worse over in places like China. But latterly, that kind of trend really reduced because a lot of consumers, as they sort of rise to being more middle class, then sort of want legitimate products. So have you seen a change? So as much as you've sort of there is that difference, do you feel like it has changed over the time that you've worked over there, or it's remained fairly constant?
For the time I've been in China, AI was kind of very early stages in production, so I haven't seen an evolution. I've been exposed to it very little time, but I know the appetite that was for it and the appetite for its use on any form. And the marketplace that Ben referred to, some of the most popular ones are based in Asia web pages. Like you can get a lot of resources from like web pages, like Chinese web pages, Korean web pages. Like they have a lot of materials there that that a lot of people put a lot of time training a lot of models based on things they liked. But for the most part, I think all these are individual users, really, like not people, or maybe they are managing to get some profit out of it or using it in some way. I don't know, but not in general like production companies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess Ben's work is geography agnostic, so people can use it anywhere in the world, which is fantastic.
Yeah, you're gonna burn a lot of NVIDIA GPUs hours out there.
So as we sort of look then to the future, I mean, so much has changed in such a short space of time in with all things AI. I'd love to hear both of your views. So Igor, where do you think this is going from your perspective first? So, you talked about maybe 50% kind of benefit. Like, do you have a view on where you think that we're going to be in, 2 years, 5 years?
So yeah, I have several thoughts about this. So first of all, I work at DreamWorks for 17 years. So I know Jeffrey. I mean, I don't know him personally, but I work in a company where he was a very visible person. He communicated with the company often. I feel he might be off. I think his projection of how broad the AI job replacement is going to get, I think might be a bit too much. I think it's a bit exaggerated. Now, I'm part of the Guild Animation Union, and the Guild Animation conducted their own studies, and then they have some projections about department by department, what is the potential job loss based on the implementation of the tools in 3 years. And some departments are hit much harder than others, and that is definitely a fact. But there's one thing you guys have to be aware of. The movie industry and animation and content production was getting to a really, really tough situation because the budget started shortening, deadlines increasing, quality demands increasing. The strikes really hurt the industry. The streaming bubble really hurt the industry. And to be honest, a lot of artists found themselves with impossible amounts of work, with impossible amounts of quality to be produced. And in a way, I look at some of these AI tools as some new guns that they can use against these constraints in movie production. Like there's the factor of job loss is definitely there. I'm very aware of it. But listen, this is something that happened in the past. Like I remember I went to DreamWorks Animation when animators were transitioning from 2D movies into 3D movies. Those guys, they knew nothing about 3D animation, and they were amazing animators. And whoever could move, they adapted, but whoever couldn't, they start doing other jobs like storyboarding or like just leave the industry. So, and I think this happened along history many, many times as new technology came in. I agree with Ben. The biggest issue with AI, it came fast and furious. It hit us so quickly and evolved so fast that it's the biggest danger of AI, that it just moves too fast. Even for my own personal taste, that I'm a lover of this technology, I think it moves too fast. I can barely keep up with the daily developments. The truth is this: I think it's gonna get to a bit of an stabilization process. Like I think there was a lot of developments, a lot of things that hit. There was a lot of new things coming out. Now there's a lot of very visible barriers, and I think a lot of the development is going to be probably focused in the next period of time, polishing all these barriers that make AI not so usable in many ways. And it remains to be seen how far this can get, because still it's not very clear. Right now, if you want to use AI in production, you need to use a lot of workaround that require a lot of artist work, clean up, projection, different tools usage, and it's not straightforward AI usage. But yeah, there's definitely a danger that these tools become really good in some parts of the production, and there's like a bigger percentage of job replacement because of this process. There's also the possibility that there's more need for content creation, and the ability to be able to produce faster, cheaper, keeps more people employed. I don't know. There's multiple views out there.
I mean, that seems like a fairly sort of balanced view, sort of positive to negative, to be honest. I mean, Ben, you mentioned, sort of going back to when you sort of talked about your different stages, you talked about this sort of horrendous future where everyone's put out of work because AI's, stopped, put out people out of jobs. And then there's no source material to be made, and then AI blows up, or whatever. So, I mean, do you? I mean, that it seems fairly sort of extreme. I saw something recently, just as an example, maybe on the positive side. It was a dancer, and they videoed themselves dancing, and then they'd got the kind of motion capture, and they'd got this sort of beautiful AI version of him dancing, but it created this whole different kind of layer and depth to this performance. And so it was kind of, one of these sort of like clickbait, whatever it was, Instagram things. But it was sort of saying that this is a really, new way of AI kind of allowing us to create art. And is that not creating something new and novel? And is that not helping a positive flywheel?
So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think humans are incredibly creative. Some more than others. Like most folks I think watching this are much more creative than me, for example. But in terms of how it's used, for sure there are positive uses. Where people are conscientious about using a model primarily on themselves. There, I would still say, yeah, you're still using a tool that really would not exist if it weren't for the, sort of appropriation of someone else's life's work at really large scale without consent. But if you sort of gloss and look past that and just look at the application of it, yeah, I mean, it is true that you can create new things, right? But I think the real question is, it's not whether there are positive uses. Yes, almost everything has positive uses, but the real question is what the balance is on the whole, right? And Igor talked a lot about this, and I think it's very interesting. I think thinking again, and I've pardon my sort of broadening of this, and I've talked to and I've testified in front of government committees and whatnot. And some of these applications are really quite broad, but generally speaking, there's this other pervasive content take, which is that people see this as an efficiency tool and they think, okay, this is going to help alleviate some of the stress. And I think in the beginning it does. The problem is that, and Igor knows this, and we all know this, at least in the US, it's a very capitalist society and everything is about a bottom line. Movie studios need to make money and shrink budgets and costs and so on. And so what first happens is, okay, you get a tool and perhaps it helps you speed up things a little bit, maybe storyboarding, maybe ideation. The problem is that the minute that really takes a hold and the managers up at the director level and higher up business groups, what they will actually do is they will see that and they will want to squeeze that efficiency out. So it's not that you're going to do 70% of what you used to do and be paid the same amount of money. No, it's that four of your coworkers will be fired and you'll be asked to basically do the work of all five of you using these AI tools. Because that's the expectation. That's what the corporate folks are going to try to want, right? And I think that's really pervasive. And whether it's, I've heard the same argument about efficiency, and because a lot of people are overworked and a lot of sectors and industries are in need of more efficiency tools, whether it's, AI in medicine, whether it's, AI in creative industries like this. Absolutely, there's a need for creative tools, or efficiency tools. But the problem is that does not actually manifest in the way that we really hope it does, right? It's going to put people out of work because that is the cheaper way to operate at a corporate level. And then if you can have the same budget for a much smaller team and then have them do the work of many, that's what people want. That's what the corporate folks want. So I think, yeah, there's always pluses and minuses, right? And it's really just a question of, how these things evolve and as they're applied and what actually happens. And I think there's an overreaction always when these things come out. The hype is dominating. Everybody gets overexcited by what they can and cannot do. And oftentimes companies use this, and it's tech companies, it's movie studios. They lay off far more people than they should because they think that this efficiency is going to be magical and groundbreaking. And then they realize they can't actually do that. And then they start hiring people back, right? But there's always that sort of, settling down effect. But yeah, it's going to take time. I will just say finally that I think AI is near its peak. It is not this exponential shot to the moon that keeps on getting better. And every year you can just say, next year, all these problems will be solved. The reality is that these are mimicry machines that are very, very good at what they do, but they're almost entirely dependent on what data you feed it. And the reality is that within a short amount of time, we have already taken everything that we have and fed it to these machines. So things are slowing down in terms of growth and quality and those kind of things, because there's only so much you can extract from the content that we've been feeding it. So I think there might be broader applications, but the quality will not be, significantly changing in the next year or two.
And just on that, I mean, that's an interesting point. I've never heard that before, actually. This sort of slowing down piece. There's there's all the hype and, can we contain it? The story of AlphaGo, that good old AI a few years back that really sort of changed everything, and certainly China's view on what they needed to do on AI. My understanding of the reason that got so good was that it trained itself. It made synthetic data and it trained itself. So does that not keep the exponential curve ticking?
There's a fundamental difference between AlphaGo and chess and what we have in these industries that we're talking about, whether it's software engineering or creating art or creating illustrations or movies or anything like that. And the fundamental difference is that AlphaGo has rules. Reinforcement learning, which AlphaGo is largely built upon, requires a reward function. You need to know when you're screwed. You need to know when you're winning. You need a function to estimate how good your board is at any given moment. If you have that, then absolutely you can have automatic feedback and you can learn yourself. You can just randomly try things until look, this strategy tends to do better. Never thought of it before. It doesn't matter. I can learn it now. But guess what? That doesn't happen with art because art is subjective, right? Art, music, writing, all these things. Why does a new style become popular? Because the general population of humans deem it to be popular, right? And until AI has a full-on emotion perception module that sucks in the angst, the experiences, the trauma, the emotions, the human connections that we all have, and is able to then appreciate things at a human emotional level, it will never be able to write a reward function that says, oh, I just tried this random thing and it evokes this emotion in me, therefore it's going to be good and I want to explore this style more. It doesn't do that. Humans are still the arbiter of what is good in creativity. And so until that changes, AI is always going to be following, mimicking, and hoping that it gets better. But that's the fundamental difference between something like Go, chess, any sort of predictive game with rules, and what we're talking about today.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, you never know. They could be sort of secretly A/B testing us in all sorts of different ways and monitoring our reactions. But totally fair point. Okay, just to sort of round us off. For people listening, this is a pretty, even Ben, with your idea that there may be this sort of tail off, it's a pretty dizzying sort of field. Like, in terms of giving people advice of like where to go, certainly Glaze and Nightshade, that's one fantastic resource. But is there anything else from either of you, Ben or Igor, that you would sort of direct people to as sort of resource or information that people could use either to keep up to date or maybe the sort of forewarned sort of thinking?
Well, I mean, if you go ahead, to me, I mean, I'll warn people to be very cautious about where they get their information about AI usage, AI outputs. Again, I say this all the time. There's a lot of hype surrounding AI tools. There's a lot of people on YouTube making channels about, look, I did this in 5 seconds. And many of those things are absolutely not true. And people have to be really aware of what's the reality of AI and what is not. And they just cannot blindly believe anything they get fed either online or on YouTube. Like, people has to be more cautious about their understanding of AI and, find the right resources, understand a little bit better what AI does and what doesn't. And I think that should be the people that is really scared about AI, like, happening right now. They should jump into this and try to get information.
Ben?
Yeah, I actually really agree. I think Euro makes a really great point. There are videos out there that have been debunked because people are basically misrepresenting what AI is doing and capable of doing, for example. I would just say that I think there's a lot of resources out there, but there's just so many developments in terms of legal issues, in terms of copyright issues, in terms of employment and economic issues. It's difficult to actually keep track of all of it. There are some resources like John Lamb, the artist, has a what's it called, create-don't-scrape.com, where he tries to aggregate all the news and all the information in one place. There are organizations like that that really try to disseminate good, timely information, and that's really critical. Yeah, I would just say, hang in there, because I think I talk to a lot of artists on different aspects, different stages, different types of artists, and a lot of them are getting hit really, really hard. But I do think that the hype bubble is kind of bursting. And I also think that, given a little bit more time, we are going to have such what is the word I'm looking for? A inundation of slop, AI, low quality AI slop in many different countries, many different societies, that people are going to violently react in the opposite direction. And I think people are going to change their values to value human created art much more so than AI. And I think that's just a matter of time. But in some places it's happening faster than others. I think actually in Asia, just because how fast they've adopted AI, that sort of backlash is starting to happen. I've heard from some artists in that region. So it's interesting. I think that dystopian future where you look desperately for the human created content as opposed to the commoditized plastic content that's out there is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So yeah, it's just fascinating to see all of it evolve in real time.
Amazing. Well, that day when you get human-made stamps on products, it'll be interesting to see. Igor, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. For those people listening, we'll make sure that the information we've covered, and particularly on those models Ben talked about, we'll put that on withrouge.com. Thank you again, guys, for joining. Thanks for those people listening. Join us on the next podcast.
And that's us wrapping our first episode. We might be a little bit biased, but we're pretty thrilled about how it turned out. So clearly AI is everywhere, and yet most of us are still grappling with its applications and use. The answer is far from simple. There are big differences between user-generated content and professional-grade animation. There are differences in usage and perspective in the West versus the East, and there are big differences between tools that automate or expedite tasks versus those that capitalize on artists' work without consent or compensation. Looking beyond the hype, today a lot of the tools may fall short in practical application and still involve a lot of manual post-production work, but the further into the future we look, the more difficult it is to predict what will happen. Job displacement to some degree will happen for sure, as will cost reductions, and so will change in the fundamentals of many roles. But to be forewarned is forearmed, and so we'll certainly be trying to keep up to speed in all things AI. This episode was presented to you by Rouge Collective. We're incredibly grateful to Igor and Ben for being our very first guests on the show, and we're going to be back soon to talk about other topics close to our hearts. Stay tuned.